And now for the decade of 1840. What happened in the decade of 1840? Well, one notable event in the United States was when the United States had a war with Mexico. And what was that war all about? I suppose the history of that war goes back to the fact that Texas was originally part of Mexico, and then there was a war of independence in Texas where Texas won independence from Mexico. That was where the famous Battle of the Alamo took place and all of that. And then shortly after Texas won independence from Mexico, Texas joined the United States as a new slave state. And then James Polk became president, and he wanted to take more land from Mexico. He wanted to expand the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and to take what would be present-day California and Arizona and New Mexico, to take all that land, which was at that time was still part of Mexico, but Polk wanted that for the United States. And so he was looking for a way to have a war with Mexico so that we could take that land. And to do that, he staged a border dispute. So at this time, most people would have thought that the border between Texas and Mexico was at the Nueces River, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But Polk decided to declare that the border was at the Rio Grande River. And so once he assumed that the border was at the Rio Grande River, he then ordered the military to have troops cross the Nueces River into land that, well, most people thought was part of Mexico. And not surprisingly, then Mexican forces attacked the U.S. forces, and then Polk used that as an excuse to get Congress, support from Congress so that he could declare war on Mexico. And it worked. We had a war with Mexico. The United States won that war. And as a result, we got the land that Polk wanted from Mexico. Mexico gave the United States all the land all the way to the Pacific Ocean, present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico. All that area became part of the United States. And also, 1840 was the decade when telegraphs first started getting used. So that telegraph machine that could send messages, the dots and dashes, the click, click, click messages sent with an using electricity to send a message over a wire. So Samuel Morse invented the telegraph. 1843, Congress voted to use money to construct a telegraph line from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. And then the next year, 1844, Samuel Morse himself sent the very first telegraph message. If you want a bit of trivia here, I believe the very first message he sent was, "What hath God wrought?" So note this makes a big difference for communication, because prior to this time, if you wanted to send a message over land, it had to be written on paper and then given to someone, and that person had to either carry it, they could walk or run or take a horse. It would be a lot faster, but it took several days or weeks to get a message from one part of the country to another. And now it was such that we could start stringing up telegraph lines and have messages that would be sent immediately from one part to another. So this made a big difference for the speed of communication across the country, the use of telegraphs. Another thing that happened in the decade of 1840 is this is when a large number of people from Ireland began immigrating to the United States to escape the Irish potato famine. So Ireland was hit by a severe famine that was caused, well, it was caused by several things, including a lot of political factors, but one of the key causes was there was a blight that destroyed potato crops. And at the bottom of this page, I have a picture that depicts what a potato blight looks like. And the potato actually is quite interesting because the potato is from South America. And the potato was imported from South America to Ireland and Europe. And they discovered it would grow well there and became a major food source. But the problem is that when they imported the potato to Ireland and Europe, they only imported one type of potato. And that was a problem because if that one type of potato was susceptible to a disease, then a disease could wipe out the entire potato crop. And that's what happened. A potato blight wiped out the potato crop. There was a severe famine, so Irish people began immigrating to the United States to try to escape that famine. Now, the people who were immigrating were Irish, and the Irish were a little bit different culturally from the current residents of the United States. Also, they tended to be Catholic. And so this was followed in the United States by a surge of prejudice against Irish people and against Catholicism. Irish people were portrayed as being aggressive, as being unintelligent, as being prone to drunkenness, and Catholicism was portrayed as being incompatible with democracy because it was presumed that the religion required allegiance to the Pope, and if you have allegiance to the Pope, then you can't be supportive of democratic ideals. So much as today, sometimes people have the mistaken idea that people who are Muslim can't have allegiance to the United States or to democratic ideals. At this point in time, people thought that if you're Catholic, you can't follow democratic ideals. So there were riots opposing Irish immigrants. There were acts of violence against Catholic and Irish people. For example, there was a burning and destruction of Catholic churches. In addition, people formed a new political party called the Know Nothing Party. So what was a Know Nothing Party all about? The name comes from the fact that they were sometimes secret about their activities, and sometimes if people asked them what they're doing, they would say, well, I know nothing about it. But the Know Nothing Party had a platform that was specifically to oppose immigration and to oppose Catholicism. So the incoming wave of immigrants from Ireland led to a political party that opposed that immigration and opposed Irish people and opposed Catholicism. Also in the 1840s, that's when gold was discovered in California, and there was a gold rush of people wanting to go to California to dig up and discover gold and get rich quick. One interesting thing about the gold rush is that the gold rush drew people from the United States on the east coast of the United States. People wanted to go from the east coast to California to look for gold. It also drew people from China. People from China wanted to go to California to look for gold. And the interesting thing is, and we might not realize this from our modern perspective, but at that point in history, it would have been a lot easier to get to California from China than it was to get to California from the east coast of the United States. Because if you were on the east coast of the United States, you had actually three options of how you might get to California. You could cross the continent by land, like using a wagon train, and that was the slowest, most difficult route. So going over land would be an incredible difficult journey to take. You could get on a boat that would go all the way around down the tip of South America and then come back up the coast on the Pacific Ocean to get to California. That was a very long, dangerous boat ride. Or you could take a boat to go down to Panama, and this was before we had the Panama Canal, but then you could get off the boat and then cross the land at Panama on foot to the other side, and then get a boat on the other side and then go up the Pacific coast to get to California that way. But all those options would have taken you a lot longer than if you were in China. You just simply got on a boat and crossed the Pacific Ocean and got to California that way. So it's kind of interesting to note that people from China could get to the gold rush easier than people in the United States on the East Coast. It was much more difficult for them. Also, given that we're at Baylor University, I want to make a note that it was the decade of 1840 when Baylor University was founded. So let's take a look at some of the common academic viewpoints on race in the United States at this point in history. Not surprisingly, what we're going to find is a lot of very racist viewpoints. Within the academic community, the idea of polygenesis was especially popular. That's the idea that black people and white people are two separate species. So, for example, here we have Samuel Morton, and here's a picture of Samuel Morton over here. So Samuel Morton, he's sometimes described as the originator of what's called the American School of Ethnography. It was a line of work that supported a polygenesis viewpoint. So he was a famous medical doctor and author. He was a professor of anatomy at Pennsylvania Medical College in Philadelphia. And in 1839, he did some kind of a study. I don't know exactly how he did this, but he did some kind of study where he reportedly measured almost 100 skulls of black people, white people, and people from different race categories, supposedly. And he concluded, based on his work, that Caucasians had the largest skulls and were therefore the most intelligent of all races. Another example from the same time period, Josiah Nott, who was actually he was actually a follower of Samuel Morton. And he reported, and he was partly concerned about the idea that if black people and white people are different races, then maybe it could be especially problematic if they mate and have children. It'd be kind of like some kind of a cross-species child that could be especially problematic. So he reported that biracial women that we had like come from two separate races, was the idea that biracial women were bad readers because they were a product of two distinct species. And he thought that their children then would have shorter lifespans than either white people or pure Africans, as he called them. So that was the idea of Josiah Nutt. And then another example here, Edward Jarvis, another academic publishing research regarding race. And he looked at census data from the United States, and he found that census data reported that the free black people in the North were 10 times as likely to be insane than enslaved black people in the South. And so he concluded slavery must have a wonderful influence on the development of the moral faculties and intellectual powers of black people, was his conclusion. So he concluded that black people benefited from slavery. Obviously, we look back on that and say, well, of course, they probably weren't reporting cases of mental illness or of insanity, as they called it then. That probably wouldn't have even been reported among the slaves. It's not surprising that if you're assessing free people, you're going to find more instances of so-called insanity. So anyway, as we see here, though, the common theme, the common thought within the academic world in the United States was essentially a very racist viewpoint that supported the idea of polygenesis. Now, up to this point, I have not said a whole lot about women's rights, but it's important to note that for over half the history of the United States, women did not have the right to vote. And at this point in history, in the decade of the 1840s, women were clearly treated like a kind of a second-class citizen. For example, they didn't have property rights. So if a woman got married, all of her property would become property of her husband. If she got a job, and there weren't very many jobs available for women, and the jobs that were available were all very low paying, but if she did get a job and she was married, any money she made would become property of her husband. So in 1848, there was a convention in Seneca Falls that is typically considered the first seeds of a women's rights movement. So this convention was held. I believe they had one day that was all women attending, and then another day that was women and men attending. It was a fairly small convention. I think only a few hundred people attended. But at this convention, they made a call for equal treatment for women and men under the law. And they made a call for voting rights for women. They thought that women should have the right to vote. Now, this was probably something ridiculed by most of the men across the country, but this was the first seeds of a women's rights movement. And a key figure in this movement is pictured here. Elizabeth Cady Stanton she was at the convention and a key leader in the beginnings of the women's rights movement. And now let's return to our story of the James family. If you recall where we left off, Henry and Mary had gotten married, and they lived together along with Mary's sister Kate. The three of them all lived together, and mostly they lived off of their inheritances. Henry and Mary came from wealthy families, and they inherited enough money that they could live off their inheritances without working. They probably weren't wealthy enough to be classified as a super wealthy elite of the society of the time, but they were wealthy enough that they really didn't have to work, and they lived in nice houses, and sometimes they hired a servant. So now Henry, or who eventually would be called Henry Sr., he wrote philosophical and religious books, and he gave lectures. And when he gave lectures, Mary, his wife, always faithfully attended. Given the sexism of the time, she was probably expected to do that. Now, Henry was rarely successful enough to make any money from his work. He also, reports are, he probably drank heavily and probably met criteria for alcohol dependence. So then in 1842, while Henry and Mary and Kate were staying at the Astor House in New York, which is a fancy hotel place in New York of the time, and it's depicted actually at the bottom of your screen, shows a picture of the Astor House. And so it was while they were staying at the Astor House when their first son, William, was born. And William, as I mentioned before, William will go on to become the first psychologist in the United States. And William was the first of 5 children. And actually, these 5 children were all born within a span of about 6 years. So the first was William, and then the next child was Henry. And Henry James, or Henry James Jr., Henry would actually go on to become a very famous author. In fact, in general, in terms of American history, Henry James, the author, is probably more famous than William James, the psychologist. So there was William, then Henry, the author, and then there were 2 other sons, Garth and Bob. And then after that, finally, the last child was a girl named Alice. And that was the beginning of the James family. Now, the James family is a family that was continually on the move. They were always changing locations and moving from one spot to another. They lived in several places in the United States, several places in Europe, and often going back and forth. This screen here is something I put together that shows you all the places where William James, that is the future psychologist, this shows you all the places his family lived when he was a child as he was growing up. If you just trace the numbers and the arrows, it shows you all the places he lived. I think William James attended maybe 9 different schools between the ages of 10 and 16. And in addition to that, he had numerous private tutors in many different cities. Henry, the father, Henry Sr., kept on moving the family and kept on changing his plans. Some people speculate that maybe this was a symptom of his heavy alcohol use. Often his plans and his ideas were based about what type of education he thought would be best for William, and maybe to a lesser extent, what would be beneficial for his other children. It seems like William, as a firstborn son, was kind of his favorite, and he really, really wanted William to have an outstanding education, but his ideas about education were always unorthodox and a little bit weird sometimes. So, for example, at one point he enrolled the boys, which, by the way, generally the boys received the education, and the daughter, their last child, the daughter, she really was not allowed to receive much of an education because she was a girl. But the boys, at one point, the boys got enrolled in this experimental school in Switzerland that included a large playground full of gymnastic equipment, excursions to the Alps, riding on mules. They did things like plucking fresh strawberries to eat and daily bathing naked in the Rhone River. But then after a few weeks of that, Henry, the father, became disillusioned with that school and moved them from that school. And at that point, they moved the family to Paris and got private tutors for their children. So it was this type of thing. He was always changing his plans and always moving the family around from one point to another. So, as I mentioned, William James, the future psychologist, probably attended about 9 different schools between the ages of 10 and 16. And Kate, Mary's sister, often lived with the family. Now, it seems Kate was relegated to the role of taking care of the children. She functioned something like a full-time nanny for the family. Now, she didn't always stay with the family. There was one point where she had to leave the family because Mary and Kate, their mother, was dying, and it was expected that Kate would go and take care of their dying mother. And there was also another point where Mary and Kate had a brother that was sick, and it was expected that Kate would go take care of the brother. This was just part of her expected duty. She was a woman, she was single, so it was expected that, well, of course, you will go and take care of sick family members whenever they are ill. Now, another interesting thing about the family, and maybe this is partly because they moved around so much, and it might have limited the children's ability to interact with other kids. It might have made the family more dependent on each other. But for whatever reason, one of the things the family did for entertainment, it seems, is that William James, the future psychologist, sometimes wrote mock love poems to his little sister, Alice, and then read those poems out loud, kind of as a type of family entertainment. Now, I'm not sure what Alice thought of these poems. Given that she was a girl, she probably didn't have much say in the matter. But here I have an example of a poem that William James wrote to his sister. He said, I swore to ask thy hand, my love. I vowed to ask thy hand. I wished to join myself to thee in by matrimonial band. So very proud, but yet so fair, the look you on me threw. You told me I must never dare to hope for love from you. Your childlike form, your golden hair, I never more may see, but goaded on by dire despair, I'll drowned within the sea. Adieu to love, adieu to life, since I may not have thee, my Alice sweet, to be my wife, I'll drown me in the sea. So William James, one of the things of the family entertainment there, he wrote mock love poems to his sister. So William James, the person that would go on to become the first psychologist in the United States, grew up in a family with a father that was very unique and had a lot of interesting and unusual ideas. Here is a picture of Henry James Sr., the father, along with Henry James Jr. That would be the second son, the one that went on to become the famous author. And so, for example, when William James was just 2 years old, the family lived in England at that point. And the father, Henry James, had some kind of panic-like experience that he called his vastation. And after having this vastation, he became very depressed. He described his vastation this way. He said, quote, some damned shape squatting, invisible to me within the precincts of the room, raying out from his fetid personality, influences fatal to life. I'm not exactly sure what that means. It almost sounds like he's having some kind of hallucination. Some people have speculated maybe it was alcohol withdrawal. Anyway, he became depressed. Doctors recommended that he avoid reading too much. That was actually a common theory at the time, that if you're feeling depressed or anxious, it might be because you're having too much brain stimulation. And so to treat symptoms of depression or anxiety might be to remove stimulation from your life, like don't read too much because that might be too much stimulation that could be causing the depression or anxiety. They also recommended spas and baths and recommended fresh air, which if you recall, miasma theory was another popular medical theory, the idea that illness can be caused by bad air, and if you're experiencing some kind of illness, getting to better air might help you improve. Anyway, later on, he became interested in writings of a person named Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a Swedish naturalist who himself reported having a lot of different visions. So Swedenborg believed that he had talked with angels, he talked with God and Jesus and people from hell, and Swedenborg believed that he had the correct interpretation of the Bible and that everything in the physical world is an expression of a more real spiritual reality. So Henry James got really interested in Swedenborg for a while, and then he switched and he became interested in something called Fourierism. This was a utopian movement started by Franco Fourier, and this movement envisioned a society where everyone was free to work on whatever they wished to do. And Henry Sr., at one point, he started promoting the idea of free love, and he criticized monogamous marriage. And note, these are probably some of the ideas that he discussed in those lectures that he gave, where his wife, Mary, was expected to faithfully attend and listen to him talk about his ideas promoting free love. I don't know what she thought about that, but she was expected to attend. Now, in some ways, the father, Henry James, was progressive. He criticized factory labor. He was sympathetic to the abolitionist movement, although he never was active in it. But one thing to note about the father and about the family in general is that his views towards women were very repressive. He was certainly sexist. Here's one quote I have for Henry James and how he describes women. So he describes women this way: man's patient and unrepining drudge, his beast of burden, his toilsome ox, his dejected ass. So he certainly was very sexist in his viewpoints, and Mary, his wife, was always expected to be supportive. And we can also think about or imagine what it might have been like for their youngest daughter, Alice, as a girl, to be growing up in a family that maintained these types of sexist viewpoints. There are certainly sexist viewpoints that were common and pervasive at this time in history, but in thinking about the James family, one thing we can think about is how did this sexism influence the women in this family?
Says when the shadows fall, a light shines out, a call for compassion and sorrow. Maybe we can be the people with hope for tomorrow. 'Cause when the shadows fall, a light shines out, a call for compassion and sorrow. Maybe we can be the people with hope for tomorrow.
Now, let's go back to Europe and to that area around the German states, or specifically here, we'll go to Prussia and to the city of Berlin, where this person here, Johann Müller, was doing work. And this is going to do a couple things. One is that we're going to continue the story of events that will eventually lead to the beginnings of psychology as a new academic discipline. And also, this is going to continue the story of researchers getting a better and better understanding of how the nervous system works. And fortunately, this part is not going to involve any cruelty to puppies. So, Johann Müller proposed an idea that turned out to be largely accurate, and he called it his law of specific nerve energies. The basic idea here is that perception is determined by nerve stimulation and not by the objects that do the stimulating. So he would say that perception is possible even if there's no stimulus, that if a nerve is stimulated, that will produce perception regardless of whether there's something there to stimulate the nerve or not. According to his law, that stimulation of specific nerves causes specific perceptions. The actual objects themselves do not directly cause perception. So a single source of stimulation can produce multiple sensations if it stimulates multiple nerves. Or conversely, different sources of stimulation on a single type of nerve will all produce the same sensation. So according to his law, a single nerve can only determine one type of sense, that perception is determined by the nerve stimulation and not by the object stimulating it. It's one of those things that to most people, it doesn't seem intuitively obvious, but we know today this is actually largely correct. Now, Müller had several students and followers, and these people all turned out to play some important roles in our story. So who were Müller's students? Well, the people on this page were all students or followers of Müller. And together with Müller, they formed a small club, and the name of their club was the Berlin Physical Society. So the Berlin Physical Society was a small private club, and this club, the key theme in this club is that they were opposed to dualism. So what do I mean by dualism? So dualism is essentially a belief that we have a mind and a body, and that the mind and the body are two separate things, and that the body is entirely physiological, but the mind can include things that are not physiological. So they were opposed to that type of dualism. Note that today, a lot of people seem to believe in that type of dualism, the type they opposed. For example, sometimes if someone has some kind of symptoms, It's not uncommon to hear another person ask, oh, are there symptoms, are there problems psychological or are they physiological? And if someone asks that question, if someone asks, are those problems psychological problems or physiological problems, that question necessarily assumes dualism, because the assumption behind that question is that something could be psychological that's not necessarily at the same time physiological. So if you ask, is something psychological or physiological? If you ask that question, it means you're implying dualism. And so now they would not have used the term psychological, physiological, but they were opposed to that type of dualism. Actually, the way that they stated it was this way. So they said, their statement was, no other forces other than common physical chemical ones are active within the organism. So the Berlin Physical Society, they were opposed to dualism. Now let's look at, see who some of these people were. We have down in the lower left, we have Carl Ludwig. And I put him here. One thing that's interesting about Ludwig is that eventually Pavlov will study with Ludwig. And we'll talk about Pavlov later on in our history of psychology discussion. Over here on the right lower bottom, I have Ernst Brücke. And I suppose actually he's interesting because at one point, a young Sigmund Freud will study with Brücke. Early on in Freud's education, he studied with Brücke. And let's see, up at the top, I have, on the left-hand side, I have Emil Du Bois-Reymond. And Du Bois-Reymond, actually, he did some very important work trying to understand nerve transmission. Specifically, he was able to demonstrate that nerve transmission is electric. Now, prior to this point, people had some ideas that it might have some electrical properties, but he was actually able to, he took a frog and was actually able to measure the voltage of an action potential, essentially. He was able to demonstrate that the nerve impulse is electric. And actually, after he did it on a frog, he wanted to try it on himself, and he actually blistered his own arms so he could insert electrode things to try to measure the nerve voltage in his own arm. And then on the top right-hand side, I have Hermann von Helmholtz, and he will play probably the biggest role in the story for the history of psychology when psychology becomes a formal discipline. Someone will study with Hermann von Helmholtz who will become, I will say, the first psychologist in the world, maybe. Hermann von Helmholtz also did work on nerve transmission. He actually did work trying to identify how fast nerve transmission was, and he did some research demonstrating the speed of nerve transmission. So that is the Berlin Physical Society. So I mentioned previously that Charles Darwin was a naturalist, which was a kind of a popular type of scientist around this time in history. And now I want to introduce to you another naturalist, pictured here, Louis Agassiz. And Louis Agassiz will be important in our story for a couple of reasons. And as it turns out, one of those reasons will be somewhat surprising, but I'll save that for later. So Louis Agassiz was a naturalist from Switzerland, and as a naturalist, he would have studied things like fossils and zoology. He studied different types of animals, and he studied fish, and he studied geology. In fact, early in his career, he did a lot of work studying geology. In fact, I have a picture here. There we go. From one of his early studies in Switzerland, where he was studying glaciers. And studying glaciers, he actually came up with a theory of ice ages that today we realize is largely true. So he was looking at glaciers in the area of Switzerland, and he saw that there were rocks at the bottom of the glacier. And then he saw that a few miles down from the glacier, there was a village, and there were similar types of rocks in that same village. And so he thought, at some point in history, that glacier must have extended all the way down to that village. And so he thought at some point in history, glaciers probably covered a larger area of the Earth than they cover today, and that maybe the Earth has gone through different stages, and that some points could be called ice ages, where glaciers covered a larger mass of the Earth than they cover today, which today we know that's largely true. So Agassiz came up with a theory of ice ages. And this picture here that was drawn from his early study is an interesting picture too. If you look at it, can you see the people in that picture? Down at the bottom, underneath the rock there. But over here, here's the little people down there. So interesting to look at the pictures from earlier points in science. And one of the things to note, in fact, here is some other pictures from about Agassiz, is that at this point in history, that if you wanted to be a scientist, and especially if you wanted to be a naturalist, one of the skills you had to have is that you had to be a good artist. Because at this point in time, you couldn't take pictures of stuff because photography hadn't been invented yet, or it was just about to be invented, but not quite yet. So you couldn't go out and snap pictures of the things you wanted to study, and so you had to be able to draw them. So if you wanted to be a naturalist and a scientist and report your work and show people what you were discovering, you had to have a good way to draw it. You had to be a good artist. And actually, it turns out that Agassiz, one advantage he had is that his first wife was Cecily, and she actually was a good artist, and she helped him out by doing a lot of the drawing. And this page here, you see a self-portrait that Cecily drew of herself, and the second picture is one that she drew of her husband, Agassiz. And then the third picture is a picture that she drew, an illustration of a fossil that was used in one of Agassiz's publications. So to be a scientist at this point of history, you also had to be an artist or had to have connections to an artist, because art was a good part of what you had to do. Otherwise, people wouldn't see what it was. Now, unfortunately, it seems as Cecily and Agassiz probably did not have a very happy marriage. She seemed to be depressed sometimes. He would often go out on long expeditions studying glaciers, and she would stay behind, and then he'd come back with all of his friends and people he's working with. And it seems like they weren't close. And actually, at one point, she moved out, and they separated for a while. So in general, it seems like they might not have had a very happy relationship. So anyway, in our story, what happens is that in 1847, and in the United States, here's I got another picture here. In 1847, in the United States, Harvard decides to found a scientific school. So now at this point in history, especially in the United States, universities did not really teach science. That might almost seem surprising from today's point of view, where we assume that science would be a big part of what they would teach at a university. But at this point in time, universities taught things like classics, and you'd go to learn philosophy, and you do memorization of things, and you'd learn Latin. But scientific study and doing experiments and scientific research, that really wasn't part of what they taught at universities. And so Harvard was wanting to make some changes, and Harvard wanted to start teaching some of the science. And so at Harvard, they founded this new school called the Lawrence Scientific School, where they would start teaching science. And they offered Louis Agassiz a position to come and be a professor in this new Lawrence Scientific School, and Agassiz accepted. And so Agassiz came to Harvard. Actually, he left Cecily behind, so it seemed like they were estranged. Cecily stayed behind in Switzerland. Agassiz come here. And actually, sadly, Cecily died of tuberculosis about a year later. We've talked about how diseases were very common at this point in history. Things like tuberculosis, people often did die from, and Cecily died from tuberculosis shortly after Agassiz came to the United States. So anyway, Agassiz comes to the United States. He's at the Lawrence Scientific School. And essentially what happens is that Agassiz is going to become probably the most famous scientist in the United States at this point in history. Recall, or I mentioned, that this naturalism was a very popular type of science, and when Agassiz came, he was already somewhat famous for his theory of ice ages, and he was a big name coming to the United States, and now he was established at Harvard. And so now Louis Agassiz is pretty much the most famous scientist in the United States. And to close out our discussion of the decade of the 1840s, I want to pick up on our story about the asylum movement. So recall that the asylum movement was all about trying to establish asylums where treatment could be provided to people with what today we would call mental illness, or at that point in history they called insanity. And recall that each asylum was led, the director of each asylum was a medical doctor or a physician that was called the physician superintendent, who was in charge of the asylum. And at this point in history, the asylum movement had grown to the point, and enough new asylums had been established, that a new organization was started called the Organization of Physician Superintendents. So this was an organization for the medical doctors who were providing treatment for people with what today we would call mental illness. Now, at this point in history, they were still called physician superintendents, but later on, these are the people that would be called psychiatrists. So this new organization can sometimes be considered the beginning of the profession of psychiatry, the beginning of psychiatry with the Organization of Physician Superintendents. It was founded in 1844. And also, when they founded their new organization, they also started a new journal, which they, at that point in history, they called it the Journal of Insanity. So the Journal of Insanity was founded. And this picture here shows you the front plate for the first volume of the Journal of Insanity. Also, the picture of the asylum there, which, as you can see, that's getting to be the asylums are probably getting larger in size than they were several decades earlier. But that asylum in the picture was a picture that was actually in that first issue of the Journal of Insanity, is where that picture comes from. And at the Organization of Physician Superintendents, later on, they would change their name, and that would become the American Psychiatric Association, is what that would become eventually. So 1844 is the beginning, essentially, of psychiatry.